Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast. As always, I am your host, Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today for the very first episode of the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast for 2026, officially kicking off the 19th year of me doing this podcast. My guest today is Azul DelGrasso, who recently earned his Ph.D. at the California Institute of Integral Studies in California, obviously, and he wrote his dissertation on 5-MeO-DMT. So I thought, wouldn't it be great to have Azul on the podcast? I read through his dissertation. We had a great conversation, which was actually recorded. Let me see. When did we record this? Wow, that was recorded back in October, so it's been a little while, but we're kicking off the new year with this conversation with Azul. But of course, I have a few announcements first, so we'll get to that in just a minute. Let's see. First of all, I want to thank Minnie and Derek, both of whom signed up as new patrons over at my Patreon page, patreon.com/MartinWBall, while I was out on break in Costa Rica with my family over the holidays. Both Minnie and Derek signed up at a level that gets them access to the Entheogenic Evolution Archive, which is available for all patrons who sign up at the $20 a month and up level. And there are a couple hundred hours worth of talks and interviews and all kinds of stuff over there, exclusively available at the Entheogenic Evolution Archive at my Patreon page that are not available anywhere else. Of course, as I always mention, there's everything from $1 a month up to $100 a month over there at Patreon. There's no obligation. You can change your support level at any time. You can cancel. You can sign up as a free member. But if you appreciate the material that I put out on this podcast, I invite you to consider signing up with a monthly monetary contribution to show some support. And of course, at the top levels, you get either a 30-minute monthly video call with me or a 1-hour monthly video call with me. And a lot of people like to use that for their own integration. Sometimes it's for mentorship. I do work with integration coaches and also facilitators and providers. But it's open. It's whatever you want to use those 30 or 60 minutes for every month. All right, next on my list. I have officially set dates for the next round of my 5-MeO-DMT Integration Specialist training course with Mindscape Institute. The next round of the course is going to start on March 4th. It's offered on Wednesday afternoons from 3 to 5 p.m. Pacific time. And all the classes are video recorded and made available for students who aren't able to make it to the live in-person class. It is limited to 15 individuals. I've got information about the class available at my personal webpage, martinball.net, and also my integration webpage, non-dual-entheogenicintegration.com. You can swing by either of those places if you want a few more details. Just feel free to reach out. Send me a message at martinwball@gmail.com. I'm happy to share the syllabus of the class with you. This is a 9-week-long class. We're going to have 2 weeks break in the middle as I will be traveling over the spring break time period with my family. So it'll be 11 weeks total with that break included. Really excited to be teaching this class. I've done 2 rounds of it so far. Students have really appreciated and enjoyed it. It really is a form of education around 5-MeO-DMT integration that you are not able to get literally anywhere else in the world. So I think it's a very unique class, very unique program. There's so much material that I have to share with you. Just keeping in mind, I've been working on this for the past 18 years, essentially, of writing books about 5-MeO-DMT, talking about it, communicating about it, working with people on it, offering integration and support from a non-dual and energetic perspective. And all of that material comes into the class. It really is my baby. I'm really excited about teaching the 3rd round of this class. So it's open for enrollment. Reach out if you want more details. Also, speaking of Mindscape Institute and integration, I am going to be traveling to Iceland coming up on the 12th of this month, and I'll be there through the 23rd. So if you are interested in having an integration call with me, I am available for this coming week, and then I'll be out for a couple weeks, and then again at the final week of the month of January. just shoot me an email at martinwball@gmail.com if you want to set up a call for either before I go or when I come back. Also, in Iceland, I'm going to be giving a talk which is open to the public at the White Lotus in Reykjavik, and that will be 11 a.m. on Sunday, the 18th. So if you happen to be in Iceland and you want to come to a public talk, hey, there's your opportunity. Would love to see you there. And I think that's about all that I have in terms of announcements for today. I would also just share that had a great trip with my family in Costa Rica over the holidays. If you enjoy photographs of tropical birds and wildlife and scenery, then I do invite you to stop by my personal Facebook page, Martin W. Ball on Facebook. I've got hundreds of images of photographs that I took over our trip, including the orange sea snake of Costa Rica, which was kind of crazy. We were out on a boat and there's this bright yellow orange snake. We saw two of them in the water with all these dolphins. It was crazy. Even got some photographs of the resplendent quetzal in the Concha. I always mispronounce it. But in one of the mountain reserves up there in Monteverde. Just a really spectacular trip. Lots of great photographs. So if you want to enjoy some of those, just stop by my personal Facebook page. And of course, I also post some of those to Instagram, but I post a lot more on Facebook just because, there's a lot of images. Anyway, that's all I got for now. Let's go ahead and get into this conversation with Azul DelGrasso from a couple months ago, talking about his dissertation that he wrote with the California Institute of Integral Studies to get his Ph.D. on 5-MeO-DMT. Here we go. Well, I am welcoming on to the Entheogenic Evolution podcast today Azul DelGrasso, who I believe is now officially a doctor of transpersonal psychology. Would that be correct?
Doctor of Transformative Studies and Consciousness from the California Institute of Integral Studies.
Yeah, so the PhD has officially been awarded. You've jumped through all the hoops, and
I've jumped through all the hoops, done the oral defense in February, graduated in May, and now just adapting to what it is to be doctor.
Yeah. Are people calling you doctor yet?
They are, and it's I'm still not used to it, but it's starting to gently land within my nervous system.
Yeah. Do you ever find yourself having to tell people, well, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a different kind of doctor?
Just on a couple of occasions.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Martin.
Yeah. It's it's a big transition. Getting a PhD is a big deal. It's a lot of work, and we're going to talk all about it today. So, to the listening audience, the reason why Azul is here is because he recently wrote his dissertation at the California Institute of Integral Studies on my favorite topic. It's about, and I'm going to go ahead and read the title. It's 5-MeO-DMT and Unitive Consciousness, Reframing Self, Global Justice, and Ecological Renewal Through Entheogenic Rebirth. What a title. And so we're in some of the same circles. We happen to know some of the same people. And I was encouraged, oh yeah, you've got to read Azul's dissertation. And so that's how we organized this here. But Azul, just welcome to the show. We're going to talk all about it. And again, congratulations on receiving your doctorate degree. And
thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. So Azul, I always like to start with guests, particularly if they're a new guest on the podcast. And maybe we'll skip over this if we come back at another point and have another interview. But just want to start with kind of letting you introduce yourself. And, the standard questions are always well, how did you get into the world of psychedelics and what got you interested in 5-MeO? But we'll get into all of that. But first, let's start with you. Let's get to know you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Who is Azul? Born and raised here in Denver, Colorado, Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho land. And my mother's lineages are the Colorossi clan of Romani. My father's side is Italian from the two Sicilies, Naples and Sicily. And was always raised in this idea of communal and ceremonial magic. And it started working with entheogens probably at the age of 17 in both recreational and ceremonial settings. And from early on, I've been working in public health up until last year when I retired from public health, but had worked in HIV prevention, STI prevention and treatment, patient navigation for 28 years, which I tell people kind of gave me a great foundation to really be in the psychedelic space. Um, I live here in Denver, Colorado, but formerly lived in Los Angeles for 12 years, where I was introduced, like you, to the Temple of Awakening Divinity in Halucius Nation,
Hmm.
and had my first experience of 5-MeO in Topanga Canyon, of all places. And took this last year off to really wrap up the research on the dissertation, which really kind of started at Naropa University, where I did do my degree in transpersonal ecopsychology, um, and looked at my thesis there was 5-MeO DMT and reconnecting people with their ecological identity. And that was the foundation for the dissertation. And I kind of knew that first semester at Naropa, like, yeah, this is going to be longer than 40 pages, longer than a thesis. And graduated May of 2020 on Zoom from Naropa and started CIIS in September of 2020 at the COVID year. So, what else can I tell you? Yeah, that's pretty much me at a 35,000 foot level.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so we're going to talk a little bit about the schools, but let's start with Naropa. I'm sure that many listeners have heard the name of Naropa University, but there's probably some that haven't. And what can you tell us about Naropa? It has sort of an interesting background and a little
Yeah.
backstory there about Naropa.
It's interesting. Naropa was started over 40 years ago by Trungpa Rinpoche and Allen Ginsberg. Ram Dass was one of the contributing founders, but was really one of the first schools to provide contemplative education and mindfulness education approach from kind of this Buddhist lens. And growing up in Colorado, it was kind of like one of those universities that was always out of reach. I grew up in the city here in Denver, and Naropa was up in Boulder, still up in Boulder. And but it's always fascinating me as someone who has grown up with a strong spiritual practice. And shortly after I moved back from Los Angeles in 2016, I started kind of looking at different schools. There was something I wanted to birth, and found the transpersonal ecopsychology program at Naropa University. And they offer, not only transpersonal ecopsychology, but regular transpersonal psychology programs, mindfulness, somatic programs, but really kind of based in the world of um, more of a different approach to education.
Yeah. So do you explain for us what is transpersonal eco-psychology? What does that mean? If we just translate it into non-academic speak, how are you going to explain
Sure.
that to someone off the street? Is like, what are you studying at that weird Buddhist hippie school?
Yeah,
I don't know if anybody
transpersonal.
ever said that to you. Sorry.
Actually, I say that a lot. But transpersonal psychology is really about going beyond the veil of just traditional psychology. It's going into ideas of spirituality, uh, someone's connection to the divine. And so when we think about transpersonal eco psychology, it is going beyond the veil, but how our relationship, our health, our spiritual health, physical, mental, is all directly related to the health of the planet. And John Seed, a ecopsychologist, has this beautiful saying. He goes, ecopsychology is ecopsyche logos, meaning that knowing that Earth is home to the soul. And that's something that deeply resonated with me after my first experiences with 5-MeO was knowing that Earth is home to the soul. And so what can I do to be a good steward of that health? And so transpersonal psychology is really studying our relationship, how our relationship is directly connected to our relationship to the planet.
Okay. So let's back up another moment. So if I got the timeline correctly, your first
Yeah.
experience with 5-MeO at the Temple of Awakening Divinity with our buddy Hal, who I'm sure he's listening to this at some point. So let's go ahead and give a shout out to Hal. Thanks, Hal. Shout out to
Yeah.
you. At what point did that arise within your own life and your own interests? So if I'm getting the timeline correct, that
Yeah.
came first. You went to Naropa next.
Yes.
Is that correct? So
Correct.
yeah, let's get into that a little bit and about what that experience was like for you and how that might have impacted your trajectory of what you wanted to do with yourself and your life and your intellectual focus.
Yeah, my intellectual focus had always been Latin American studies. I have my first master's was in Latin American studies from Cal State LA. I was really interested in border health and border studies, the revolutionary movements of Latin America and the Southwest. And in 2012, actually, I went to Burning Man for the first time and started to rekindle a relationship with entheogens. And late 2013, had a dear sister, give a shout out to her, Ashley Booth, and Amanda Coulong, who said, "Hey, you should come sit with the temple with this sacrament." And at that point, I had never heard of 5-MeO. I'd heard of DMT, I've heard of ayahuasca, I had relationships with psilocybin and other sacraments. And so I said, okay, I'm up for it, especially after being blasted open after my first Burning Man experience. And it happened to be my birthday on January 15th of 2014,
Mm.
where I had my first rebirthday. And I sat with our brother Hal in this beautiful temple in Topanga Canyon, not really knowing what to expect. I had kind of witnessed a couple people in the circle go first and saw their presentations, and I'm like, okay, this is interesting, and going in with some humility and some nervousness. Um, and then I was served, and as some of your listeners may know, and as it's different for everybody, but I found myself exploding into the infinite cosmos, where I was no longer Azul. I was no longer had the identity that I thought I was,
Yeah.
but found myself in the ineffable we. Um, and I remember coming out of state and looking at our brother Hal and saying, "How long was I gone?" Kind of like Jodie Foster said in the movie Contact,
Yeah.
goes through the alien machine. How long was I gone? And he says, "Oh, just 35 minutes." And I had experienced the absence of time and all the universe in 35 minutes. And that level of ontological shock that I experienced um, changed my course and direction permanently. Um, and so, as I said during my oral defense back in February, I said, I feel like this dissertation is actually the final integration piece from that first ceremony
Mm.
that I did back in 2014. So 11 years of integrating, which birthed the dissertation.
Yeah. So it sounds like it had a pretty big impact on you, which I'm not surprised about. I'm curious for yourself, would you describe that experience with 5-MeO as the first real entry into that unitive state of being for yourself, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, I would say it was the first time I had gone over the edge. I had been in ceremony with my father many times with psilocybin mushrooms and had gotten very close. And why I didn't go over is because I didn't surrender enough.
Yeah.
And so with 5, it's there's all you would have to do is remember to breathe and surrender. And that's when I finally surrendered. So it really was kind of like my first experiences into the non-dual unitive consciousness state.
Yeah. So sounds like maybe you would agree with these statements that I like to make, that I do say that with most other psychedelics, what we tend to get is what I call non-duality within duality, where there can be a deep sense of connection, a deep sense of identity, but it's usually still filtered through the egoic perspective, where people say, I am a part of everything. I am in a state of unity with all of reality and all the things, but it's still through that lens of there's still a perceiving subject that is perceiving various objects, and that there's a state of unity among this collection of manyness versus when we go over that threshold with 5-MeO and the individuated perspective is temporarily obliterated, then it's just the unitary state of
Yeah.
allness and everythingness. But that's pure non-duality. It's not non-duality within duality. So it sounds like for you, this was an important distinction in having gone over that threshold into that state of full surrender and the complete dissolution of the individual self.
Absolutely. And, I would agree with that statement because when we think about, traditional psychedelics or sacraments, there is that, well, how do I place myself within this experience? With five, it is just not that. And I remember for weeks afterwards, Ram Dass has this saying that we're all God dressed in drag.
Yeah.
And I would just talk to people like, oh, I'm talking to myself.
Yeah.
But this person doesn't know that they're God. And yet I just had this experience. I am God, goddess. I am the ineffable we, but so are they. And so every person I encountered, and it's a practice I still use to this day, like, oh, I'm just interacting with myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great one. And honestly, that's something that comes up a lot in my integration calls with clients when they ask me like, well, what do I do now? I've had this experience and this realization, and that I usually tell them is like, yeah, well, then just treat everyone as though they're yourself because they are. And, we're like that statement of everybody is God and drag, that the drag is the ego, that's the clothing, the outfit that they're wearing that says like, I am this individuated identity. And I always like to also reinforce that we are that identity. But we're not just that identity. That's what this reveals, is that we are both of these things. We are the human being that we are embodied as and experience the character that we perform as, yet we are also this unitary being in consciousness that is everyone and everything, so that we are then initiated into the ability to see both sides of that coin and that the fullness of identity rather than being trapped in the individuated sense of self.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's like Alan Watts says, the whole nature of the Godhead is to remember that it's not, And so as our egos are dressed in drag, it is us intentionally forgetting who we really are. And that's why I love 5-MeO, because it really is the sacrament of remembrance.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like for you, given that it then led to your master's and your Ph.D. dissertation, sounds like it became a central focal point for you.
It really did. And I think at the time of my experience, there were really only three books out. Yours, Entheogenic Evolution, the Tryptamine Palace, and then a year after I had my first experience, Ralph Metzner's The Toad and the Jaguar. But what I found myself is, having worked in clinical settings for decades at that point, is what does this mean? How do I integrate this? How does this inform how I show up in life, not only with myself, my family, my community, but with the broader world? And after that first experiences, I continued to go to Burning Man, of course, but I found myself in places like Standing Rock, with the Standing Rock movement, the Dakota Access Pipeline protest that took place in 2016. And my Burning Man camp actually went there for 6 months, and we offered some infrastructure, dome space, energy, internet, and so forth. Experiences like that where you see kind of the impacts of neocolonialism still impacting native lands and native peoples was really kind of that 5-MeO plus experiencing that set me on this direction of, okay, how do we think about ecological renewal? How do we think about repositioning our relationship with the earth and being in right relationship? And at that time, I really thought, well, a beautiful way to expedite relationships are through entheogens, are through what I had experienced of 5-MeO DMT. One of the things I'll share is the next day after I woke up after my first journey with 5-MeO, I was able to forgive the individual who sexually harmed me as a child for 7 years. And I felt such a deep sense of forgiveness for that individual. that if I can forgive that, then how can I show up better in the world for other people? Um, and so that level of forgiveness kind of carried me through on how continued to show up in acts of service. It continued to show up in my subsequent experiences with 5-MeO. And I always like to say I have this beautiful friend named Marta. She's from Puerto Rico, and I remember interacting with her after my first 5-MeO experience, and she says, I don't know what this is. I don't know what you did. But she goes, before you did 5-MeO, you were an asshole. She goes, and now I love you. So whatever you're doing, keep doing. And so seeing how I showed up in the world, not only for myself, but my friends, from this space of love and not fear, really became a driving force to be like, I want to know more. I want to know more about five. I want to know more of the history of five, but I also want to know more about, and I started to think about models of consciousness and what do people need to know in regards to five that can be a sibling offering, such as your books, such as the work of James O'Rourke, Ralph Metzner, and other folks who've written about 5-MeO.
So something I want to focus on here a little bit is this idea that your experience actually augmented your sense of being of service and engaging in social action and environmental action and cultural action and justice. And so I want to focus on that a little bit because sometimes what happens as people go through a non-dual experience, such as with 5-MeO, is that some people do turn to what I would consider the intellectual traps of absolute solipsism and nihilism. And at the social level, sometimes this plays out in terms of what we would call like spiritual bypassing. Okay, where somebody says, hey, nothing matters. It's all just God anyway, so who cares about results or outcomes or what's actually happening within reality? Or sometimes I see this if I make a post on social media that I am making a statement about current social or political realities, there's inevitably someone's going to come in and say, well, hey, that's not unconditional love to actually be critical of something that's happening. And like, we just got to be chill with everything. Yet there are people like yourself that you actually feel inspired to action, inspired to work for progressive healing and transformation. So you have not fallen into the absolute solipsism or nihilism trap. But this comes up with a lot of people around these non-dual experiences and these spiritual experiences where it encourages them to adopt a nihilistic worldview or just engage in spiritual bypassing. If like, oh, I'm not going to get involved or, that's not important to me. What would you have to say about that? And why do you feel for you that it became an impetus to continue to engage in such action rather than just step back and say, fuck it, what does it matter?
That's never been part of my personality to say, fuck it. I've been on my own since I was 14, lived on the streets as a kid. I know what it's like to collect food stamps. I know what it's like to be shot at. And early on, I had friends who did pass from gang violence. And that still happens in my community to this day. I knew early on I wanted to be of service. I didn't know what type of ministry that would look like. But in the 90s, I had friends passing from HIV and or complications with HIV AIDS. And there was no one there for them but us, the kids on the street. And so I started volunteering at 18. Doing the AIDS walks, doing HIV testing, counseling, patient navigation. Being of service has always been part of my life. And so with 5-MeO, it only cauterized that even more to be more of service. And so where I was of service, and at that point I had been working in the field for almost 2 decades, it just made me wanted to do more because there was more need. And even today, there's still more need. Um, and I feel like as I've moved from trauma-informed healthcare into the entheogenic space, those 28 years were really my foundation of great, here's some systems and models that I can use in the entheogenic space. When I started volunteering, I saw that licensed clinicians didn't want to work with people with HIV and AIDS, especially in the Latino communities. It was only the nurses. It was only people who showed up as caseworkers, non-clinical folk, who really wanted to show up in that space. And that kind of created my aversion to going the clinical route when I
Mm.
started pursuing the uh, uh, transpersonal psych degree at Naropa. Really because, I know what it's like to show up for community. And so for me, it cauterized, I still want to be of service. And now I have 28 years of experience of being of service. And how can I bring that into the psychedelic space where there's not a lot of that? There's a lot of people saying, oh, this just reaffirmed my identity that I am God and I can do anything I want. Or as you mentioned, there's this level of spiritual bypassing. Sometimes I call it trespassing because people haven't done the work. Uh, they want to be the sage on the stage and not the guide on the side. A lot of the times, they want to be the rock and roll of psychedelics, which is fine. That if you want to take that route, okay. But Ram Dass has this saying that we're all walking each other home, and he was a big influence on me as a kid, as I started really taking the spiritual path. And so, what are we doing to walk each other home each day? What are our acts of service that we can do? How do we pay it forward to those acts of kindness that we've received? And so, this research and this dissertation is a love letter to my community and also to the shoulders of those giants I stand on, such as yourself, Halucious Nation, James Orrock, Ralph Metzner, and other folks in this space of, great, what's the next iteration of how can we look at this and examine the impacts of 5-MeO, but also at the main time being of service to myself, my community, and my family.
Yeah. Well, thanks for speaking on that, Azul.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. So let's return now to Naropa.
Yeah.
So I always kind of like to talk about the academic side of things when I've got academics on, and I
Yeah.
bring out how, well, back when I was a graduate student, back in the 90s, studying at UC Santa Barbara, I had to create my own curriculum around the use of entheogens in various spiritual and religious traditions because it just wasn't something that was taught. It wasn't something that was offered. It didn't come up normally in class. So I had to kind of create my own area of study around that and sort of unofficially. But you going to Naropa much more recently,
Yeah.
you're more recently exposed to the academic world, so I'm curious, as you're developing this idea that okay, I want to do my master's thesis on 5-MeO. What was your professor's take on that? And did they do the classic of like, you mean DMT? Like, what's 5-MeO, or just what was that for you?
Yeah, I get that. I still get that a lot. Oh, DMT. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But no, it was interesting. I remember doing my interview for the program with Dr. Travis Cox, and really having a conversation about why I wanted to be in the program and talking about these experiences. Naropa was one of those places that was like, I love that idea. Just make sure since the program was transpersonal eco psychology,
Yeah.
make sure you frame it in that. And I was like, well, of course I'm going to frame it in that. So there was a lot of support. Even if the professors didn't understand exactly, like at Naropa, they understood mushrooms, they understood LSD, they might have, been up in the hills with Ram Dass and Leary at some point, or, they understood that contextual of like the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
In Colorado, we legalized cannabis over 10 years ago. And so they understood the relationship with cannabis. But 5-MeO, what's that? And, again, in 2018, when I started, there was very little information. So as an academic, like as you had to create stuff, it's like, okay, so I have some research here. I have some thought pieces here on 5-MeO. But there wasn't a lot. And I remember the first qualitative study came out in 2018 on 5-MeO, DMT, and mystical experiences. And I'm like, yes, I have some research. So it was perfect timing for me as an academic to kind of dive into this. And at that time, I had set up Google alerts on let me know when anything gets published to the internet about 5-MeO-DMT. And I was lucky that first year between 2018 and 2019, I might get a Google alert uh, once a month. There might be an article about someone who had just done it. Um, and then I started to understand that there were more studies underway, which were published in 2020, which was helpful for me at CIS. But it really is like, what are the models that were existing on psychedelics? I mean, we had the work of Dr. Rick Strassman, and so I spoke a little bit to that and kind of some of the outcomes and how and a lot of the research was really like, and future considerations around 5-MeO-DMT. And then the strange thing happened, I think it was 2019 or 2020, that 5-MeO was kind of put into the public sphere of all people, Mike Tyson, who did his interview about the toad on ESPN. And that's when people started reaching out to me more, like, my professors or other colleagues in the program, like, oh, I kind of get it. It's about the toad. And I said, well, it's not necessarily about the toad. I said, I'm really focusing on the relationship of the experience and how it's reconnecting people to their ecological selves, their relationship to nature. So yeah, it was quite the journey there, those beginning years. And by the time I got to CIS, I still get Google alerts set up way back when. At that time, I was getting maybe once a day, a couple times a week on articles. There was this interest, there was this growing interest. Michael Pollan had published his book and talked a little bit about his experience with 5-MeO. It was starting to get out into the broader sphere of mainstream media and communities, and particularly here in Colorado, where there's always been a high interest in legalizing psychedelics, which we did in 2022, where we legalized forms of DMT, Iboga, synthetic mescaline, MDMA, and psilocybin for both above and below ground use. So I just happened to be in the right place at the right time and had the academic support from Naropa and when I got into CIS around the topic I chose.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the pleasures I have of doing this podcast for almost 18 years now, starting this back in January of 2008. Oof. And, getting on the podcast and talking about 5-MeO-DMT, that the most common response that I got from people was, wait, you're talking about DMT, right? No, I'm trying to talk about 5-MeO-DMT. And at the time, on my podcast, I was basically shouting from the rooftop saying, like, look, everybody's got to be studying this. This is the most amazing molecule that exists. Why is nobody researching this? And just to highlight what you've been sharing here, pretty much the first actual, academic study came 10 years later, 2018. 10 years later. And now we're at the point where there is a lot of research that's happening around 5-MeO-DMT. And then also back when all this started, for me, back in 2008, and I'm telling my parents about it. They're like, well, that sounds weird to me. But at this point, now my mom kind of keeps track of this stuff. And actually, my dad does too. So they send me, whenever they see an article, they send it my way. Yeah. And my dad's a chemist. He's recently retired from Chico State. And things have moved to the point where he has now had his own students come through the chemistry program at Chico State who have listened to my podcast and have gone on to do research around 5-MeO-DMT and chemical derivatives. They're actually looking for, some of his former students are now looking for, can they create a non-psychedelic version of 5-MeO for therapeutic purposes to help address anxiety and depression. But it's just, part of how things have really come quite a long way from relative obscurity around 5-MeO to now there is a great deal of interest and there's someone like you've gotten your Ph.D. by writing about 5-MeO. So it's just, I like to be able to reflect on how much has changed in the time period since I've focused on 5-MeO and been doing this podcast and just where we are in the world. So it's changed a lot.
Exponentially, it's changed. And I know that I think I'm one of 3 people who have completed their dissertation on 5-MeO-DMT. I know there's one in the Netherlands. There's Annie Ortiz, who just finished hers. And I know that there's other folks doing more research on 5-MeO. I have a colleague at CIS who's looking at the transmission of 5-MeO DMT between mother and child um, during childbirth. I know there's some colleagues who are considering doing some research at Johns Hopkins at this idea of negative neuroplasticity and the overuse of 5-MeO DMT.
Mm.
I mean, so it is just it's growing, and what's making me happy is that it's just not some blog, right? There are folks who are taking it very seriously, such as yourself, who have these offerings for the community, but they're approaching it in the terms of academia. What does this mean, and how does this relate to all aspects of our life? Whether it's treating PTSD, depression, substance, or just the existential crises that people face when they're dying. I know there are some practitioners who that is their specialty as death doulas, is offering 5-MeO at the end of life in palliative care. And so, it'll be amazing to see where we are in 2028, in 2038, and beyond.
Yeah, yeah. So things are starting to pick up when you're in Naropa. More information is coming in. You're right. I think you said it was 40 pages.
It's 40 pages. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's just a little baby paper.
Baby that.
Yeah. 40 pages. Yeah. I mean, once you get into dissertation range, like 40 papers, like, man, I could do that. And I could do that in an hour.
Exactly.
But yeah, then getting to the California Institute of Integral Studies, maybe let's talk just a little bit about the school. Again, I think probably a lot of my listeners have heard of CIIS. Maybe some haven't, but maybe just tell us a little bit about the school and about the kinds of programs that they have there. And correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe they've been one of the pioneers around actually having psychedelic studies programs available there in terms of like classes you can actually take. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It was Dr. Janice Phelps who started their psychedelic certification program back in 2016. They were the very first academic institution to be able to offer that in itself. CIS, like Naropa, really started from this contemplative approach of approaching academia and scholarship. And, one of the founders and members of that was Alan Watts. And so, there's some beautiful lineages between Naropa and being at CIIS. But again, it was offering, starting out simple, starting out offering classes and then degrees. And the difference between Naropa and the California Institute of Integral Studies is they have doctoral programs.
Yeah.
And so, like, you have your somatic therapy programs, your transpersonal psych programs, your East-West psychology, religious studies. And then a little bit over 20 years ago, they started their department in transformative studies and consciousness. And that was the program that really called me in, especially being able to work with Dr. Alfonso Montori in the transdisciplinary approach to academia, the late Dr. Alan Combs, who did his life's work on consciousness, and just some of their amazing offerings. Again, just like Naropa, it felt like, this is the next step to be able to build this contemplative approach to this research and be supported by people who understand. They might not have a relationship with entheogens, but they understand the importance. And from day one, I got nothing but support from their leadership, from the department, from my committee members, but also other students who were really fascinated. At that point, in 2020, psychedelics were kind of coming back into mainstream. And so it was another institution that offered that additional support to make this research possible.
Yeah. So when you came in and said, hey, I want to expand on my master's thesis for my dissertation and continue to focus on 5-MeO, did anybody try and steer you in a different direction? Say, hey, Azul, you've already done that. Let's do something else. Let's refocus. Or how did they respond to that proposal?
With great reception, actually. They're like, oh, that's fantastic. That's great. And I think because at that time, just, like we had just discussed, I had made the argument like, here's a handful of elders and folks who have, written books and had an offering. I go, but more research needs to be done. And they agreed with me. I remember doing my interview with Dr. Daniel Delorier and talking about that. And he was so supportive in that interview process, just like, yeah, that's fantastic. We encourage that. We're going to support that. And really felt at home right away. So it was this beautiful transition. I'm glad I didn't take any time after Naropa. I had my summer off. I started at CIS, which was originally supposed to be a hybrid program, a couple weeks in person a year, and then, your online courses, and then COVID happened. So it went completely virtual. But they navigated that beautifully. But yeah, again, just all the support.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, in moving from a master's thesis into a dissertation, we've already mentioned that the dissertation is a lot longer. But for those who are not familiar with graduate school, what is the difference between your master's and your PhD, and the scope of the project, and how you go about addressing your topic?
Yeah. Well, we can think about it in pages to start off with, 40 pages to about 250 pages and beyond.
Yeah.
For a dissertation. But with a dissertation, it doesn't matter what school or program you're in, it's what is your unique contribution? What is your inquiry that hasn't been asked before?
Mm-hmm.
And mine was simple. It says, how does 5-MeO-DMT reframe our relationship to the natural world? That's where I started. And so it becomes this thing of, okay, great, I can do this lit review. Here's all the literature that is about transpersonal psych, ecopsychology, some of the publications about 5-MeO, but what is your unique contribution? And that's where, I call it the great initiation. And so started in 2020, graduated May of 2025. The difference is you're kind of approaching a master's thesis from this regurgitative space of like, here's what's out here, here's some of my thoughts, versus now I'm going to write 250 pages about what I think.
Yeah.
And I have to find all the materials that support my ideas and include the materials that don't support it. And then really examine that and see how that initial question evolves and morphs over time.
Yeah. And something that strikes me in reading through your dissertation is another shift that I've seen in the academic world is kind of the old school was you need to write yourself out of the dissertation.
Yeah.
That you, the author, you are not situated in this, because the goal is to be completely scientific and objective. So I'm going to talk about the subject, but I'm not going to talk about myself. One of the places that started to change, like when I was a graduate student, was around the topic of anthropology, that as an anthropologist, you are an outsider, and therefore you have to contextualize yourself and what your biases may be in some capacity and how you fit into the role of being a participant observer in another culture. So my dissertation, for example, was written from my time doing field work with the Mescalero Apache people in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of a question of like, how much do I write about myself and my own experience of being a white outsider working with these indigenous peoples and participating in their culture, but not being from it. And so within your own dissertation, I see that there's quite a bit about you and your own experience. And I'm not saying that in any kind of critical way or saying like, oh, you shouldn't have put yourself in there, because I think it's highly relevant, because as someone that your question comes from your experience with 5-MeO. It's not just an abstract academic question. It's like you went through your experience like, wow, I think I'm in a state of unity with everything. Like, to put it in the simple terms that we've already used here, is like the realization that I think I'm God. I think everyone and everything is God. It's only one being interacting with itself. How does that shift your relationship to the natural world? That's where the question comes from. Therefore, your experience is highly relevant to how you go about not only asking the question, but also then answering it and addressing it. So, yeah, I would just invite you to speak on that aspect of being a subject within your own dissertation.
Absolutely. And, one of the reasons why I chose this program in Transformative Studies and Consciousness is because of Dr. Alfonso Montori. who is the kind of this genius when it comes to transdisciplinary study. And we have multidisciplinary study, and transdisciplinary study is finding that thread between all disciplines. So transdisciplinary studies is not discipline based; it's inquiry based. And one of the five components of transdisciplinary study is integrating the inquirer. It's also creative inquiry. And so how can we? And it's really a shift from traditional academia. Is you know everyone has a PhD in their own life, right? In their own lived experience. And so how does that impact someone's worldview when it comes to writing a dissertation? How do you separate self from the topic that you're researching? Obviously, you have to be very passionate about a topic to want to write a dissertation and go through that process, right? But in transformative studies, it's about where is your expertise? Where does your expertise show up? And so that was actually some of the hardest part of my writing process of how do I insert myself into this? Now, obviously, I do write about, I can write about my initial experiences with 5-MeO-DMT and how that has evolved over the years. But also finding other places where I could provide that personal narrative of this is why this is important to me. This is my experience of this, whether it's looking at decolonizing psychedelics, whether it's describing the difference between a psychedelic trip and an entheogenic journey, which I do in the dissertation. You know, that was important to me because I know when I'm having conversations or I'm going through difficult times, I know if I'm talking to someone who's gone through a like situation, it's more relatable. And so I started to get really encouraged to integrate myself into this process because I know at some point someone might read it and say, oh, I can relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started to approach it from that lens of, yeah, it's like I'm telling my story, but also providing some solid, it's surrounded by this, peer-reviewed committee of folks who see it also as an academic piece of work.
Yeah. So speaking of the academic side and the review, I know that this was part of your dissertation project is that you had to do sort of the classic defense.
Oh, yeah.
This was part of my own graduate career that I did not get to have that in a sense that things went really wrong between my dissertation advisor and myself. So she had actually not read my dissertation. So I never even had like a defense or like a community discussion around it. Things really went sideways. But I know that you got to do that. So tell us a little bit about that, of where, you've done your research, you've written up your dissertation, you've got it all done, but then you have to go through sort of this academic ritual of the defense of the dissertation. How was that for you, and what was that experience like?
I've never been so nervous in my life. Yeah, I remember preparing for it. And I went up and got a cabin up in Estes Park, up in the mountains here in Colorado, and spent, I think, 4 days rereading my work during the day. And I'd make notes on what I need to think about and how to prepare. And I will say one of the most inspiring moments up in Estes as I was preparing, I said, the evenings are off. I'm going to do creative stuff. And one of those evenings was listening to your podcast with Ralph Metzner. So in the evenings, I would consume content that way. And just like, okay, I know this stuff. It was nerve-wracking. I was a nervous Nelly. And I remember the day of is, not necessarily panic attacks, but the nervousness of, I've just spent 7 years researching 5-MeO-DMT, looking at all these different models, creating new models of consciousness and facilitation and integration. How is it going to be received? How am I going to defend? And, I had Dr. Alfonso Montori as my chair, Dr. Valeria McCarroll, who was a student and colleague of Ralph Metzner's. So she knew his work extremely well. And then Dr. Angela Beers, who is Chicana indigenous local to Colorado. So I had good familiarity with their work, their body of work. having worked with them for 4 years, and then going through the process of pulling up my slides and talking about it from beginning to the end of this is my methodology and this is what I learned and um, this is what I hope comes next. Uh, it's a very like I said, nerve-wracking process, but it's also a birthing process, um, because not only do you have your committee on, in this case on Zoom, but my other colleagues and peers who are also witnessing, who had gone through this program, with some people who have already graduated, some who are still in their dissertation process. Um, to really kind of, this is my passion. This is what I've birthed into the world. This is my unique inquiry into 5-MeO DMT from an eco-psychological lens, and it was received extremely well. And I will say I had the great pleasure. Not everyone has this pleasure of, normally the committee will kind of go off into another room and discuss. But at the end of my presentation and answering a few questions, uh, they said, "Well, I think we all agree that you are now conferred." And that's the first time I was called Dr. DelGrasso. And so from nervousness into absolute euphoria. I swear to God, I thought I was going to have a 5-MeO reactivation. But no, it was just a very proud moment. I know for myself, my friends, and my family, and my community, to go from someone who was 14 and on the street to graduating CIS with a Ph.D.
Yeah. Yeah. A nice sense of satisfaction. And,
Oh,
these, my own background in religious studies that we, did a lot of focus on, the performative nature of ritual, the markings of transitions, liminal states, and rites of passage. And this is something that a lot of people miss within modern society, and especially as things have moved more into online, that we don't get these rituals and ceremonies that mark these transitional states from one identity, a graduate student, to now being someone who has their doctorate conferred upon them. That it does change your status. And that's why I asked you about, like, have people called you doctor yet? That these things do matter in that sense, that when you have the title, people treat you differently. They address you differently, and they also expect different things from you. And so to get these rituals that move us through and kind of mark that identity can be psychologically and socially very significant for people. These are meaningful events.
absolutely. And I write about this in the dissertation that, there is a spiritual thirst, especially amongst Westerners, for ritual, and for me, that was an absolute ritual. And, I contemplated, do I want to walk, and do I want to walk across the stage and do that ritual? And I did. And I'm so glad that I did, because that really closed that chapter, that cauterized the experience of being a PhD student. But, there is a thirst out there for us. How do we mark moments like this? How do we mark, whether it's a birth, not just weddings or funerals, but the in between, those little celebrations, those markations of, I'm now this person. I've taken on this responsibility. And so the idea of ritual is, there's a lack of ritual in our culture, but we can bring that back for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Azul, this is not meant to be taken in any kind of offense in any way, shape, or form. But one of the things that struck me as I'm reading your dissertation, so I've been out of, quote, academics for a while now, but I'm reading your dissertation, and in the inner commentary that's going on, I was like, wow, this is definitely a dissertation. In the sense that there's a lot of academic jargon. Of course, as a dissertation, you've got to, it's your job to reference everything that you could ever possibly reference and give footnotes and, all of that. And so one of the things that I was kind of thinking as I'm going through the dissertation was, I'd love to see how Azul would translate this into a more popular book. So that's common, right? You write your dissertation, and the next question is, okay, so you're going to publish that as a book. So what I wanted to do was invite you to, how would you describe your contribution that you're bringing to the discourse around 5-MeO in the dissertation? How would you introduce that to someone, but inviting you to not use the academic jargon. So for the layperson, like what's the upshot? What are you bringing to the table here? What are you contributing to the conversation?
No, that's a great question. And I'm actually in that process right now of what I call the translation.
Yeah.
It's the great translation from, I want this to be accessible to people who might have a third grade education, right? And I think that's important. So it's, the academic part of it's done. That research is
Yeah.
done, but now it's making it accessible. If I had read this after my first 5-MeO experience, I wouldn't understand a goddamn thing what I was trying to say. Um, at the end of the day, I hope that this is a guide that provides people with a sense of one being in right relationship with not only the sacrament of 5-MeO, but other sacraments, that it provides them a way to think about their own experiences of consciousness. There might be some new terms for them, and I will explain those terms
Mm-hmm.
More casually in that process. But what does it mean to be in right relationship with ourselves, with the sacrament, and how does that influence how we show up in the world? Very, very basic thing. And so, yeah, there's a lot of jargon in there. I do insert myself. The inquiry is integrated, but it's also with academic language. And so the next challenge is, as I talk about the work, how do I make it accessible? How do I make myself accessible? As you were saying, being a doctor, there are some expectations and distinctions having that title. How do I continue to be approachable? How do I translate this? It's interesting. I always think in the terms of my nephew Orlean, who asked me when we legalized psychedelics a few years ago. He goes, Theo, what does this mean? What does this mean for me
Mm-hmm.
that psychedelics are legal? And that was kind of an inspiring moment for me. Is rooting in that community is medicine first, and that the language we use and how we move in this space is really this idea of how do we pass the baton to the next generation. Me handing my dissertation to somebody is not passing the baton, but me being able to translate, maybe at a third grade level, 5th grade level, reading level, makes it accessible. When we think about, like the great muralist movement in Mexico right before the revolution, literacy was at an all-time low about understanding culture and history and systems. And so muralists like Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, hundreds more, started painting murals all over Mexico to educate the populace. And so I think about that in terms of, okay, what's the mural am I painting that's going to be accessible moving forward with this body of work?
Yeah. So you said that you're already working on this step. How far have you gotten? Where are you at in that process? And it really is a process of translating from the academic voice into, I would just call it the personal voice of you as an author, you as a speaker, the things that really bring you passion that you want to share. Again, when we're writing a dissertation, it's a different audience. We need to prove our academic bona fides. We've got to prove that we're masters of the jargon, that we're masters of the research. But then when we're writing for a public audience, it's totally different group of people. So where are you in that process? And I'm glad to hear that you're in the process, because I'm always supportive. Like, if anybody's got something to say about 5-MeO, it's like, let's get it out there. Let's join the conversation. It's why I like hosting people on the podcast. If I hear of somebody who's involved with 5-MeO, I try and get them on the podcast. Like, hey, let's come have a conversation about it. So where are you at in that process of doing the translation? Yeah,
I'm about 20% into that process. It's very different. I'm being a little slow with that process right now, having just graduated in May, defended in February. I'm having to learn to take off the academic hat. And so my process has been, how do I explain this to my nephew?
Yeah.
Right. And so, if I get to a paragraph and there's a bunch of citations, which, some are appropriate when it comes to the publication process, quotes and so forth, but it's like, one, I've never loved APA, and APA is a writing style for the listeners. Um, how do I move from APA into Hansel and Gretel? You
Yeah.
know, how do I translate? I'll get to a paragraph and I'll be like, okay, how do I move these citations? How do I still tell the story while honoring where I might be citing, where how do I honor the knowledge where that comes from? Um, Unfortunately, CIS has several graduates, alumni who have done that process. And so the Writing Center at CIS actually has beautiful resources on how to do
Hmm.
that. I'm utilizing those resources. But I'm being gentle in that process because I'm still taking off that academic hat in regards to this body of work.
Yeah. And that's a process.
Yeah.
Like for me, when I came out of my graduate program, um, that's actually when I first started writing as a writer. And that became, I decided that I wanted to write a fantasy epic. Not that I had any experience with that. It's like, yeah, that's what I want to do. So I ended up writing this 4-book series, Tales of Arduin. But the first book, Oribai's Vision, that's the one book that I have rewritten and edited the most in my life because it was the first thing I wrote after being an academic. And
Mm.
I was obsessed with, I'm creating this fantasy world and these fantasy cultures, but I'm obsessed with anthropological detail. So I was writing it like I was like a biblical scholar and an anthropologist, and it was very, very academic. And then it was after I wrote the second novel that I kind of found my author's voice and then completely reworked the first book. And it's every other book I've ever written, I usually just start on page one and then I write the book and it's pretty much done. But yeah, making that transition from the academic world to finding my author's voice, it was definitely a process. And I would say that first attempt at writing Oribai's Vision, I was definitely not successful in that. So I would just want to put it out there, Azul. For one, I would definitely personally, I would like to read whatever the translation is because I would just enjoy being able to compare it to the dissertation. So whenever that's ready. And I would also just put out the invitation if you ever wanted to send it my way for some comments or feedback, I'd be happy to do that. But at the very least, whenever that project is in a shareable form, just know I'd be very curious to just take a look at it and see how the translation is.
No, I would really love that, Martin. Yeah, to hear that feedback, but also the feedback on how my voice might have changed or evolved, and how different sections might look differently. Uh,
Yeah,
that's absolutely welcome. Thank you for that offer.
cool. So here's another typical question for somebody who's just come through their PhD program
Yeah.
is what's next for you and how do you see yourself applying your PhD to what comes next for you?
That's the $1 million question. What are you going to do next?
Yeah.
And that's something that they really don't prepare you for. It doesn't matter what school you go to. Well, what's next? Um, I have a nonprofit here in Denver called the Mile High Psychedelic Education and Training Center. And, I mentioned, community is medicine first. And so uh, before I left healthcare, I spent the last 8 years under a CDC contract writing curriculum for medical providers and nurses and frontline staff on creating culturally responsive clinical environments, motivational interviewing. So I have some curriculum background. My next step is really kind of creating curriculum on a whole range of topics from harm reduction. How does harm reduction show up in psychedelic spaces? What are the tools that facilitators need in these spaces? Whether it's motivational interviewing or understanding what client navigation is, meaning that you have a system of referrals. So we're kind of really diving into providing some solid trainings around those type of topics. I have my own facilitation practice here in Colorado. So the academic work has really informed how I show up in ceremonial spaces. But also, I'm making myself available to be a consultant, and potentially find the right role where we can continue to shape the conversation around proper and right relationship use with sacraments and entheogens.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're aware, but your PhD dissertation is already kind of making the rounds. I teach with Mindscape Psychedelic Institute, and we have our 5-MeO, the trauma-informed 5-MeO facilitation course. Yeah. And then I'm also teaching my 5-MeO integration specialist training course. And your dissertation, I've seen in the Signal chat among the students that your PhD dissertation is being passed around. They're reading it. They're talking about it. So it's already out there in that sense.
Yeah.
Did you know that? Did you pass it on to someone and say, hey, pass it on? Or did anybody tell you people are diving into this?
I know just, some personal friends and colleagues who've shared it with, a couple circles. I didn't know to the extent. I know that when I was preparing it for publication in ProQuest, I had the option to choose open access, meaning that people who wanted to read it didn't have to have, a student access to a ProQuest catalog. So I did that intentionally, so that it would be available. The academic work would be available to the broader audience. I did not know that it was being passed around in certain circles like that. So that's humbling, and thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, well, they're reading it, they're talking about it, and maybe that'll even help inspire. Okay, let's keep working on this translation. Because I do think, for the general audience. Again, this is not meant as a critique. I mean, this is just the reality of writing a dissertation, that there's a lot of academic jargon that just can be wordy and difficult for someone who's not in an academic background of, that there's a certain way that academics speak, and it doesn't always translate to the public audience. And also, I would say we're living in an era where there is so much weirdness around academia right now, and the idea the academics, they're the elite experts, but maybe they don't know anything. I mean, there's kind of this cultural backlash against the idea of people who are educated and who are experts in their subject area. Yeah. So that's where there is a strong need for the translation into the public audience so that they can see how academic work is applicable and relevant for those of us who are outside of academics, and why we do need people doing research and using all the lingo and the investigative models and all of that, that there's real, sorry, I'm tripping over my tongue, real world results. Because again, the topic, right, is reframing self, global justice, and ecological renewal through entheogenic rebirth. That's a relevant topic. Right. So making it accessible to people, that there's great value in that.
No, absolutely. And I didn't do this just, obviously I did it for myself. It was the big integration piece from that ceremony in 2015. But my intention this whole time, and one of the reasons why I'm happy that I was able to integrate myself as the inquirer, is to start, there's already stuff in there that's relatable. Whether I'm talking about Burning Man, I'm talking about sitting with Yahé, those different experiences. But I didn't want to do it just for sort of to sit on a shelf.
Yeah.
I want to make it accessible. So great, it's accessible to academics, people who understand that. Beautiful, they got it. Now, the mission of being of service is the translation and getting it to the populace of those who are curious to read what I researched, how it's applicable in their lives. And I create a worksheet on things to consider, considerations for facilitation. I also have a worksheet in there on considerations for integration based on Joanna Macy's work that reconnects. So the intention was okay, I'm going to have to translate this at some point. And so, yeah, it's the goal is to really make this accessible.
Yeah. So I have what is perhaps a bit edgy of a question for you. And
oh boy.
I feel that it is my responsibility to ask you this question. It's not necessarily your responsibility to answer the question, but just where we are at in terms of the current political, social, cultural environment. There's another thing that struck me about reading your dissertation is that I was just imagining, well, if there were a professor who was using this dissertation in their class right
Mhm.
now, there's a lot of things in there that I think, and keep in mind, I'm not critiquing that
Yeah.
this is about the current social, political, cultural moment that we're in. There's a lot in the dissertation that if a professor were teaching this, I could see that person getting on Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA professor watch list.
Hmm.
um, that there's a number of things in there that, according to President Trump, these are improper ideologies. These might even be markers of what he is now trying to call domestic terrorism, and things that basically are getting banned throughout the United States culture and society, and where universities and academics, they're basically getting strong armed by the current administration to not talk about the environment, not talk about climate change, not talk about social justice, not talk about racial inequalities, not talk about diversity, equality, and representation, not talk about gender, not talk about sexuality. These are all topics that are in your dissertation.
Sure.
And so I mean, I'm just struck by how, like, if I were reading this December of last year, it would have
Yeah.
been like, okay, yeah, these are all current topics in academics. And now here we are
Yeah.
in October of 2025. And I'm thinking, like, dude, this is like Trump's hit list
Hmm.
right here.
Yeah.
So my question that was edgy is like, what's your response to having gone through an academic program where these are
Mm.
considered legitimate areas of discourse, and now publicly, this is what is being described as left-wing radicalism and domestic terrorism? I mean, what the fuck? I mean, that's my response. Is like, what the fuck is happening? Um, Balls in your court. What do you have to say about that?
I mean, these topics aren't going away. How people's relationship to decolonial practices might change, their opinions might change, but it's not going to go away. Where we're talking about gender diversity or we're talking about social justice or the climate. These are issues that are not going away based on someone's talking points, based on political ideology or policy. And this is not the first time that we've seen this, in the McCarthy era of, you know, back in the 50s, et cetera. That we're always going to go through this at some point in our history. We just happen to be going through it now.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we stop the conversation. And as someone who worked 28 years in HIV prevention and being at the bedside of folks who were hated for being gay and transitioning into the next life and being witness to that, or whether seeing HIV positive mother give childbirth and the child have to be given an AZT bath as soon as it's born. That was 30 years ago. Like, these things don't go away. These discussions don't go away. And at the end of the day, we can frame it in a way that this is how you talk about things in right relationship. These are considerations that people need to know, whether it's decolonial practices, whether it's thinking about what is adaptive versus negative cultural appropriation, whether it's talking about medical mistrust. I think all facilitators should really examine their mental schemas, implicit and explicit biases, which I speak to in the body of work. Um, and we're not in right relationship. Erase this idea of global warming and climate crisis. Well, when you look at the evidence and you see the piles of plastic floating around in the ocean, that's not right relationship. I think everyone can agree that something needs to be done there. When we look at putting uh, oil pipelines through wetlands, for example, or sacred lands or sovereign lands, we can have a discussion about that. Um, and the idea behind all this is to get people thinking about how to be in right relationship, not only with themselves, with the sacraments, but with their environment and their communities. Um, so, I mean, we can be afraid, or we can continue to have the conversation and invite people in instead of call in versus call out. I will say I do find interesting is that psychedelics seems to be the one bipartisan issue amongst political parties. And I say that because AOC from New York and Dan Crenshaw put language into last year's Defense Reauthorization Funding Act about legalizing psychedelics, including 5-MeO-DMT, for active military personnel. And I know folks at the DoD right now, the Department of Defense, who are actively looking at how to implement that. But that happened as a bipartisan issue. And so when we think about the impact that these sacraments have as far as treating PTSD, especially with our veterans and active service members, we can engage the conversation from that standpoint. And then we talk about the historical and cultural use of sacraments and say, well, there's a level of appropriation because these people have been using it for thousands of years. Just because you're new to it doesn't mean you know how to use it. And that's beyond just 5-MeO. And so I think there's a way that we can bring back the art of conversation in a bipartisan way to talk about these things. There's going to be some people on both sides who don't want to have the conversation, and that's fine. But I think as an academic, as an activist, as someone who, has marched in the streets, has been arrested, for protesting, like, I get it. Like, this is my life's work. And for me, that ideology will evolve, but it's not going to change on what we need to talk about.
All right. Well, Dr. Azul DelGrasso, thank you for joining me in conversation today here on the Entheogenic Evolution podcast and sharing about your research and work with 5-MeO-DMT and your dissertation project and all the little side conversations we've had here around this topic and your journey into where you are now. And I just want to thank you for bringing 5-MeO into an academic context, for doing that work there and for pushing this forward. And I definitely look forward to, as I've said, seeing how this translates into more general consumption for the public, and also just look forward to wherever you carry this work forward from this point on out. So let's continue to stay in touch about it. And hopefully at some point we will say this was the first time that you've been on the podcast, and there will be additional additions at some point in the future as all of this work continues to evolve. And who knows, maybe I'll be doing this for another 18 years. And so then we'll even be able to say, like, yeah, remember back in 2025 when we had that conversation, and then we can reflect on how much things have changed since then. And hopefully all for the better.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. I really look forward to that and the future work.
All right. Well, thanks for your time today, Azul.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.